In the quiet countryside of Virginia, 1834 was supposed to be like any other year. The farms were green, the towns small but steady, and life followed its ordinary rhythm of planting, harvest, church gatherings, and family ties. But behind one unremarkable farmhouse, hidden in the rolling hills of the state, lay a secret so horrifying that when it came to light, it scarred the region's history forever. That farmhouse belonged to the Sullivan family, a name that would become etched into American folklore as a symbol of darkness, secrecy, and unimaginable cruelty. The story begins with whispers. Villagers in nearby settlements had long regarded the Sullivans with suspicion. They were not outsiders by blood, but they behaved differently. The family rarely mingled with neighbors. Their children were rarely seen playing in open fields or walking to school. The farmhouse itself was a place shrouded in silence. Curtains were always drawn. Lamps flickered at odd hours of the night. Some said they heard chanting carried across the wind, the kind that made the hair rise on the back of your neck. And then came the disappearances. At first, a child gone missing could be explained away, a runaway, a tragic accident, or a family moving without notice. But as the numbers grew, and as the names began to overlap with families who swore their little ones had simply vanished without a trace, questions turned into fear. Mothers refused to let their children walk alone after sundown. Fathers carried rifles when traveling to town. It was only a matter of time before someone dared to look deeper into the Sullivans' isolated home. What they found would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in early American history. Beneath the farmhouse, hidden behind a locked door and a staircase descending into the earth, was a basement. Inside that cellar, in the suffocating dark, were 47 children. They were chained, starved, and broken, their faces pale from the absence of sunlight, their voices barely a whisper. Some wept, some sat silently staring at nothing, and others clung to each other as if to hold on to what little humanity they had left. How could such a thing exist? How had it been hidden so long? These were the questions that haunted Virginia in the months that followed. The Sullivan family claimed that it was not cruelty, but faith, that these children were chosen, part of what they called a covenant. In their twisted belief, keeping the children confined, bound, and obedient was a sacred act, a way to purify them for something greater. To the outside world, it was nothing short of madness. The discovery of the Sullivan basement spread quickly beyond Virginia. Journalists traveled from Richmond, Washington, and even New York to see the site for themselves, though many could not bear the sight for long. Some fainted at the smell of decay. Others wrote in their columns about the silence of the children, a silence more terrifying than screams. Rumors grew with each retelling. Some said the Sullivans sacrificed the children in rituals. Others claimed that the family sought immortality through their suffering. Whether superstition or truth, the lines blurred, and the legend of the Sullivan family became darker with every passing month. Yet the most frightening part of this story is not just the cruelty, but the secrecy. For years, the Sullivans hid their deeds in plain sight. They worked their fields, attended church on occasion, and spoke politely when necessary. Behind closed doors, however, they built a private world of control and terror. This duality, normal on the surface, monstrous underneath, is what makes the story endure nearly 2 centuries later. It is not only about what was done, but how easily it was hidden. To this day, historians debate how much of the Sullivan curse was real and how much has been shaped by myth. Did all 47 children truly belong to the basement, or has the number grown in retelling? Were the Sullivans truly fanatics of a self-made religion, or were they simply abusers cloaked in the language of faith? The answers may never be known with certainty. What is known, however, is that the Sullivan family left behind a legacy of fear, grief, and unanswered questions. This is more than a local tale. It is part of America's darker past. A reminder that the line between civilization and horror is thinner than we imagine. The Sullivan basement is not merely a cellar in Virginia soil, it is a symbol of what can happen when secrecy festers, when fanaticism takes root, and when society looks away until it is too late. As we look back at 1834, we are forced to confront not only the cruelty of the Sullivan family, but also the silence of those who allowed it to grow. This is the story of the chained children. This is the story of a covenant born in darkness. This is the story of the Sullivan family, whose curse continues to echo through time. The morning sun had just broken through the fog when the first rumors started to spread through the village. A boy from the neighboring town had not returned home the previous night, and his frantic mother swore she saw him last wandering the fields near the Sullivan farm. To most, it was not surprising. The Sullivan family had long been the subject of nervous whispers, their large farmhouse standing apart from the rest of the community, as though distance itself could shield others from whatever strangeness took place inside. The villagers spoke quietly of them but rarely acted, for fear of what they might find. But this time the fear of a missing child outweighed the fear of the Sullivans. By noon, a group of men gathered at the tavern, each carrying the hard expression of someone determined to seek the truth. The Sullivan farmhouse stood tall. Weathered by years of storms, its wooden boards gray and cracked like the lines of an old face. The curtains were, as always, drawn tightly shut, though the faint outline of movement could sometimes be seen from within. The men approached cautiously, their boots crunching on the dry dirt road, and with every step closer, the silence grew heavier. It was a silence that seemed unnatural, as though even the birds refused to sing too close to the property. When they reached the front porch, the leader of the group, a farmer named Thomas Green, knocked firmly on the door. No answer came. They knocked again. Still nothing. A few exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them muttered that perhaps this was a mistake, that perhaps the child had simply wandered elsewhere. But Thomas would not leave. He had lost his own nephew 2 years earlier, vanished without explanation, and he still carried the suspicion that the Sullivans knew more than they ever let on. With a determined shove, he forced the door open. The smell hit them first. It was a heavy, cloying odor that made several of the men gag and cover their mouths with their sleeves. It was not the smell of rot exactly, but something close. Damp wood mixed with mildew and something sour that seemed to cling to the back of the throat. Inside, the house was dim, lit only by the faint daylight seeping through cracks in the curtains. Dust floated in the still air. A clock ticked faintly somewhere deeper inside, the sound too steady, too loud in the silence. The parlor was furnished like any other home, a worn sofa, a table with a Bible resting neatly upon it, candlesticks placed as though awaiting the Sabbath. Yet the longer they looked, the more it seemed wrong. The candlesticks were melted to nubs, used far more than seemed normal. Strange symbols had been scratched faintly into the wood of the table, half hidden beneath the Bible. And there was no sign of the Sullivans themselves. The men split into pairs, searching room by room. Upstairs they found neatly made beds, though none looked as though they had been slept in recently. Children's clothing was folded in small piles, but no children were seen. A woman's bonnet lay abandoned at the foot of a bed, and beside it a leather-bound journal, though the handwriting inside was so frantic and uneven that it was nearly unreadable. One man swore he saw the word covenant, repeated again and again across its pages. Downstairs, Thomas and another villager found a locked door near the kitchen. Unlike the others, this door had a heavy iron bolt across it, newer than the rest of the house's fixtures. Thomas struck it with the butt of his rifle, once, then again, until the wood splintered and the bolt broke free. Behind it was a staircase leading downward into darkness. A wave of cold air drifted up, carrying with it a smell far worse than before. The men hesitated. None of them wanted to be the first to descend. Finally, Thomas lit a lantern from the hearth and began to climb down. The steps groaned under his weight, and each creak echoed too loudly in the narrow passage. The others followed reluctantly, their shadows stretching long and twisted across the stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, until their breath misted before them. At the bottom, the lantern's glow revealed the edges of the basement. Stone walls, damp earth floors, and iron rings embedded into the ground. And then the light caught on movement. Dozens of small faces turned toward them at once. Pale, sunken-eyed, and terrified, the children stared back, their wrists and ankles bound in chains that rattled faintly as they shifted. Some squinted against the light, as though they had not seen it in months. Others made no sound at all, only trembling silently in the shadows. One boy, no older than 8, whispered hoarsely for water. Another rocked back and forth, eyes wide but unseeing. The sight froze the men in place. For several moments, no one could speak. When words finally came, they were shouts, cries of horror, disbelief, and rage. The men rushed to the children, trying to pull at the chains, though the iron links were thick and rusted. Some of the younger children wept softly, while the older ones shrank away, as though too afraid to trust the sudden appearance of strangers. Thomas dropped to his knees beside a girl whose lips were cracked and bleeding, pressing the lantern close enough to see her face. She flinched at the light but did not cry out. It was then he realized that many of them had no strength left even to scream. As the men worked frantically to free them, another sound echoed through the basement, the creak of floorboards above. Someone was in the house. The villagers froze, lanterns trembling in their hands, listening as slow, deliberate footsteps moved across the floor overhead. Whoever it was, they were not in any hurry. Each step was measured, purposeful, and it sent a chill through every man in the cellar. Thomas motioned for silence. The children's rattling chains quieted as they cowered against the walls. The footsteps moved closer to the basement door. For a moment, all was still. Then the bolt at the top of the door slammed shut with a metallic clang. The men shouted in panic, rushing to the stairs, but the door would not budge. They were trapped, lantern light flickering wildly as the children whimpered around them. The Sullivans had returned, and the men of the village were now caught in the same prison that had held the missing children for so long. The chapter closed not with answers, but with terror. In that moment, the villagers realized they had uncovered the truth, but in doing so, they had stepped into a nightmare far larger than they imagined. The Sullivan farmhouse was no ordinary home, and whatever dark covenant bound the family together, it had now ensnared them too. The lantern flickered in Thomas's hand, its flame sputtering in the damp air of the cellar. The men pressed against the locked door, shoulders slamming into the wood, fists pounding on it until their knuckles bled, but the heavy bolt on the other side held firm. Above them, the slow creak of footsteps continued, deliberate and mocking, like someone savoring their fear. The children huddled in the shadows, their eyes wide, their chains rattling faintly whenever one of them trembled. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of boots on the floorboards, the men's ragged breathing, the drip of water somewhere deep within the stone walls. Finally, a voice carried down through the cracks in the door. It was low, calm, and unsettlingly steady. "You should not have come here." The voice belonged to a man, though the way he spoke was almost sermon-like, each word deliberate and measured. "This is a house of covenant. You trespass against sacred ground." Thomas shouted back, his fury cutting through the fear. "These are children. You've starved them, chained them like animals. Whatever you think this is, it ends tonight." His words echoed through the cellar, but the voice above did not falter. "You see prisoners?" the man said. "We see chosen ones. They are cleansed of the filth of the world. They will rise where you will fall. We protect them from sin. We prepare them for eternity." One of the villagers spat on the floor, muttering curses under his breath. Another gripped his rifle tightly, though the confined space and the locked door left them powerless. The men exchanged nervous glances, realization dawning that they were facing not mere criminals, but zealots, people who believed so deeply in their own madness that reason was useless. The bolt above rattled again, but instead of opening, another sound followed, the dragging of heavy wood, as if furniture was being pushed against the door to block it further. They were being sealed in. The children whimpered, some crying softly now, though most remained eerily silent, as though fear had long ago stolen their voices. The villagers turned their attention to the chains. If they could not escape, perhaps they could at least free the children. Thomas smashed the butt of his rifle against one of the iron rings embedded in the stone floor, sparks flying as metal clanged against metal. But the rings were strong, rusted deep into the ground, and each strike seemed only to dull the rifle's edge. The children watched with hollow eyes, a flicker of hope breaking through their despair, but the iron resisted every desperate effort. Then, unexpectedly, the door creaked open. The lantern light caught on the figure of a man standing in the doorway above, silhouetted by the faint light of the farmhouse. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a dark coat, and his face was gaunt, framed by wild hair that fell past his jaw. His eyes gleamed with a strange fervor, wide and unblinking. This was Elias Sullivan, the patriarch of the family. His voice was the same steady one they had heard before. "You think yourselves righteous," Elias said, his tone carrying no anger, only conviction. "But righteousness is not yours to claim. These children are offerings, purified through suffering. Each chain is a bond to salvation. You cannot break what has been sanctified." Thomas raised his rifle, aiming it at the man, but Elias only smiled faintly, as if the weapon meant nothing to him. Behind Elias, shadows moved. 2 women and another man, their faces pale, their clothes simple but marked with strange stitched symbols along the hems. They stood silently, eyes fixed on the villagers with the same unsettling calm. The Sullivan family had gathered, their presence filling the air with a suffocating dread. "You will not leave this place," Elias continued. "Not until you understand. Not until you accept. You think us cruel, but cruelty is the world above, not here. Down here, they are safe. Down here, we teach them to endure." He gestured toward the children, who shrank back at the sound of his voice. "Pain is the only path to purity. Hunger cleanses. Darkness reveals truth. Do you not see?" Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, but one of the other men grabbed his arm. "If you shoot him now, we'll never get out," he hissed. Rage battled with reason in Thomas's chest, his hands shaking as he lowered the rifle slightly. Elias seemed to take the hesitation as proof of his words, his smile widening. The Sullivan women began to descend the stairs, carrying trays. On them were bowls of thin gruel, hardly more than water, and pitchers of stale water. They moved methodically, placing the bowls before the children, who reached out desperately despite their chains. The villagers watched in disbelief as the ritual unfolded. To the Sullivans, this was not cruelty but ceremony. The feeding of the children was an act of devotion, carried out with the same solemnity as a church service. One of the women, her eyes glassy and distant, looked at the villagers. "You will see in time. You will learn as we have. The covenant spares no one. Thomas could bear no more." He lunged forward, shoving past the others, and rushed up the stairs toward Elias. The patriarch did not move, did not flinch, even as Thomas raised the rifle again. But before Thomas could fire, the floor beneath him gave way. His foot plunged into a rotten board, snapping under his weight, and he tumbled forward, crashing hard onto the stone floor below. The rifle skittered out of reach. Elias remained standing untouched, his gaze never leaving Thomas. "You cannot fight what is ordained," Elias said quietly. "You can only submit." The other villagers rushed to Thomas's side, helping him to his feet, but the damage was done. Their leader was shaken, his confidence rattled, and the Sullivans still held every advantage. Elias raised a hand, and with that small gesture, the women collected their trays and withdrew up the stairs. The heavy door slammed shut once more, and the bolt slid into place, plunging the cellar back into half-darkness. The men stood in silence, their hearts pounding, their breaths shallow. Around them, the children slurped at the thin gruel, their chains clinking softly in the gloom. It was a scene of despair, of ritualized cruelty, and the villagers knew they had stumbled into something far beyond what they had expected. This was not merely a family gone mad. It was a cult, bound together by faith twisted into something monstrous. For the first time, true fear settled into their bones. They were not rescuers anymore. They were captives, caught inside the same web that had ensnared these children. And as the lantern flickered lower, casting long, eerie shadows across the stone walls, they began to wonder if they would ever see the light of day again. The cellar air grew heavier with each passing hour, thick with the damp stench of mildew and the metallic tang of rusting chains. The lantern's flame had burned low, throwing long, uneven shadows across the stone walls. Thomas sat slumped against the damp earth, his ankle throbbing from the fall. The other men whispered among themselves in hurried tones, their words sharp with frustration and fear. None of them had expected this. They had come to confront a family, perhaps to rescue a missing boy, but instead they had found themselves swallowed by something darker than any of them could have imagined. The children's faint movements filled the silence, chains rattling, weak breaths echoing in the gloom, the occasional stifled sob. One of the villagers, Samuel, knelt beside a small boy who clutched an empty bowl to his chest like a shield. Samuel tried to coax a word from him, but the child only stared, his eyes clouded with the emptiness of someone who had endured too much to speak. "They're broken," Samuel muttered, standing again. "Whatever's been done to them, it's been going on for too long. We've got to get them out. All of them." Thomas lifted his head, his face drawn and pale but his eyes burning with determination. "Then we need to think. We need to fight smarter. They may think they've trapped us, but they've given us something too. They've shown us how they operate." "What do you mean?" one of the others asked. "They believe this nonsense," Thomas said. "This covenant, this ritual. To them, it isn't just cruelty, it's sacred. That means there are rules, a system. And if there's a system, we can break it. The men fell silent, weighing his words. Above them, faint footsteps moved again, slower this time, circling the house. Every sound from overhead carried with it the weight of surveillance, as if the Sullivans were listening, waiting for the right moment to act. As night fell, the villagers tried again to test the cellar. They searched every stone for weakness, every chain for give. At the far end of the room, hidden behind a pile of broken crates, they discovered a section of wall where the stone was uneven. One of the men pressed against it and felt the faintest draft of cool air. Hope stirred. A tunnel, perhaps, or some forgotten exit. But the stones were heavy, wedged tightly together, and without tools it would take hours, perhaps days, to make progress. Still, it was something. And in their despair, even the smallest possibility became a lifeline. While the others worked quietly at the wall, Thomas forced himself to crawl back toward the stairs, listening carefully. From above came the sound of voices, low and rhythmic. At first he thought it was ordinary conversation, but as he strained to hear, he realized it was something else entirely. The words were chanted, repeated over and over, a pattern of syllables that carried a strange cadence. The Sullivan family was praying. The chant grew louder as the night wore on, joined by the sound of feet moving in unison. Then came the unmistakable crackle of candles being lit and the dull thump of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The villagers gathered beneath the stairs, listening with growing dread. "They're performing something?" Samuel whispered. "Not something?" Thomas said grimly. "A ritual." The children reacted too. At the sound of the chanting, they pressed themselves against the walls, trembling violently. One girl began to rock back and forth, covering her ears with her chained hands, whispering the word sacrifice again and again. The men exchanged horrified glances. Suddenly, the door above opened, flooding the cellar with dim candlelight. Elias Sullivan stood framed in the doorway, his face shadowed but his eyes shining with a feverish light. Behind him, the other family members stood in a circle, each holding a candle. Their voices rose and fell in unison, the chant continuing as Elias addressed the captives below. "You see the beginning of truth," he said. "Tonight the covenant deepens. Tonight the chosen are tested." The villagers braced themselves. Gripping their makeshift weapons, broken chair legs, a rusted pipe pulled from the wall, anything that could serve as defense. But Elias did not descend. Instead, he raised his hand and the chanting ceased. "Not yet," he said softly, as though speaking to the shadows themselves. "They are not ready." The door slammed shut once more, leaving the cellar in darkness. The villagers let out shaky breaths, relief mingling with terror. Whatever ritual the Sullivans had planned, it had been delayed, but not forever. "We don't have time," Thomas said. His voice was hoarse but firm. "They're building up to something, and when they're ready, it won't just be the children they come for. It'll be us too." The men returned to the wall, working faster now, clawing at the mortar with bloodied fingers. The draft grew stronger as small stones loosened, though the passage beyond remained hidden. Each scrape and thud seemed impossibly loud, and more than once they froze, convinced the footsteps above were approaching again. In the midst of their work, one of the children spoke, a boy perhaps 12 years old, his voice cracked but urgent. "The wall leads to the old well," he whispered. "I heard them once, when they brought us food. There's a way out there." The men turned to him, stunned. It was the first time any of the children had spoken beyond desperate pleas for water. His eyes, though hollow, carried a glimmer of clarity. He had been listening, learning, waiting. "What else do you know?" Thomas asked quickly. They choose at night," the boy said. "One of us, sometimes more. They say it's the Covenant's will. They take them upstairs, they never come back." His voice faltered, his body trembling. "If you hear the bell, it means someone is next." The words chilled the men to their core. They had not yet heard the bell, but its threat now hung over them like a noose. Through the long hours of the night, the villagers continued to dig, their bodies aching, their hands raw. The children watched silently, hope and fear mingling in their tired eyes. Every moment was a race against time, for they knew Elias and his family were preparing something above. Just before dawn, when exhaustion had nearly overtaken them, the faint toll of a bell echoed through the farmhouse. The sound was hollow, deliberate, each strike reverberating through the stone and earth like a death knell. The children froze, chains rattling softly as they curled in on themselves. The boy who had spoken earlier whispered one word. Tonight, the villagers exchanged grim looks. They had uncovered the truth of the Sullivan rituals, and now they knew that unless they escaped soon, they would become part of it. The bell's toll lingered long after its final strike, vibrating through the stones as though the earth itself had taken part in the ritual. The children shivered violently, some burying their faces in their knees, others staring blankly at the floor. Thomas clenched his jaw, his hands bloodied from hours of clawing at the wall. Every strike of the bell had confirmed what the boy had told them. Tonight, the Covenant would claim another sacrifice. The villagers pressed against the half-opened wall, desperation driving them forward. The stones shifted more now, the draft stronger, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint trickle of water. It was a way out, but progress was agonizingly slow, and now time was against them. Above, the chanting began again. The voices of Elias and his family rose in unison, filling the farmhouse with rhythmic echoes. This time the chant was heavier, more forceful, punctuated by the sound of a drum or perhaps a heavy board struck in time. The ritual had begun. Then came the scrape of the bolt. The cellar door opened. A rush of candlelight spilled down the steps and shadows danced across the damp walls. Elias Sullivan descended slowly, his tall frame casting a long silhouette. Behind him followed two women and another man, each holding a candle and a length of iron chain. Their eyes glowed with fervor, their faces serene as if they walked in prayer. The children whimpered, pulling back against their restraints, the clinking of their chains forming a pitiful chorus. Elias raised his hand, and the chanting above grew louder, echoing down into the cellar like the roar of a distant storm. "Tonight," Elias said, his voice smooth and unwavering, "the covenant is renewed. Tonight, innocence becomes purity. One will be chosen, and through their suffering, the rest will be strengthened." The villagers surged forward, placing themselves between the children and the Sullivans. Thomas, still limping from his injured ankle, stood at the front, gripping his rifle though it was cracked from striking stone. "No one's going anywhere," he spat. "Not tonight, not ever again." Elias regarded him calmly, as though Thomas were no more than a child throwing a tantrum. "You misunderstand," he said. "This is not yours to decide. You are not here by chance. The covenant brought you. Even your trespass serves its purpose." The women moved toward the children, their chains dragging behind them. One of the villagers, Samuel, lunged forward, swinging a broken chair leg. It connected with a sickening crack against the arm of one of the Sullivan women, who stumbled back but did not cry out. Instead, she smiled faintly, as though pain itself was holy. The cellar erupted into chaos. The villagers shouted, swinging their makeshift weapons, while the Sullivans advanced with calm determination. Elias moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Thomas. He seemed untouchable, his presence more unsettling than the physical threat of chains and iron. The children screamed now, the sound raw and desperate. Their fear filled the cellar, mixing with the smell of sweat, damp stone, and flickering candle smoke. One boy pulled so hard at his chain that blood streaked down his wrist. Another girl curled into herself, sobbing uncontrollably as the struggle raged around her. Thomas raised his rifle and aimed directly at Elias's chest. His hands shook, sweat dripping down his face, but his finger pressed the trigger. The shot thundered through the cellar, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. For a moment the room filled with smoke, the echo deafening. When the haze cleared, Elias was still standing. The bullet had grazed his coat, tearing the fabric, but he did not fall. He did not even flinch. He only smiled, his teeth gleaming in the candlelight. "You cannot kill what has been chosen," he whispered. The villagers faltered, fear rippling through them. Elias raised his hands, and the chanting from above grew louder, as though the entire house was alive, pulsing with the voices of unseen worshippers. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the sound. But in the chaos, Samuel noticed something. The wall where they had been digging had shifted further during the struggle. Stones had cracked loose, and now a small gap revealed a dark passage beyond. A sliver of moonlight cut through, proof that it led outside. He grabbed Thomas by the shoulder, shouting over the din. "The wall! We can break through now!" The men turned, throwing their weight against the weakened stones. With a roar, part of the wall collapsed inward, dust billowing into the cellar. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of wet grass and freedom. The children cried out, their hollow eyes reflecting the sudden hope. Elias's expression darkened for the first time, his calm slipping into something harder, colder. He stepped forward, his voice rising above the chaos. No one leaves. The covenant binds all who enter. If you flee, you carry it with you. The curse follows. The villagers ignored him, tearing at chains, pulling children toward the breach in the wall. Their strength came not from hope but from desperation, the raw instinct to survive. Elias lunged forward, but Samuel swung the chair leg again, striking him hard across the head. This time Elias staggered, blood streaking down his temple. His calm returned quickly, but the mask had slipped. He was mortal after all. "Go!" Thomas shouted, his voice ragged. "Get them out." One by one. The children began crawling through the hole, their chains clattering as the villagers dragged them toward freedom. The smaller ones went first, pulled through the narrow gap into the open air. The older children stumbled, too weak to move quickly, but the men carried them, their muscles burning with the effort. Elias shouted behind them, his voice no longer calm but thunderous. "You cannot escape! You belong to us now! The covenant claims you." But the villagers did not look back. With each child pulled through the wall, the resolve in their hearts hardened. Even if Elias spoke the truth, even if some curse would follow them, they would rather face it in the open air than die in the dark. At last, Thomas was the last to move, his body aching, his ankle barely able to bear his weight. He turned once, locking eyes with Elias. The patriarch's face was a mask of fury, his eyes wild, his bloodied hand gripping the chains. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Thomas spat at his feet and crawled through the breach. The night swallowed them. The villagers and children spilled into the grass outside, the moonlight silver against their pale faces. Behind them, the cellar glowed faintly with candlelight, the chanting still echoing through the farmhouse. Elias's voice carried out into the night a chilling promise. "You can run," he called, "but the covenant runs with you. You are bound now. You are ours." The villagers did not stop. They gathered the children, clutching them close, and ran into the darkness, away from the farmhouse, away from the nightmare. But as they fled, each man knew the truth in his heart. The Sullivans were not finished. And this night was only the beginning of something far more terrible. The forest swallowed them whole. Branches tore at their clothes, damp earth sucked at their boots, and the frantic sobs of children carried through the night like fragile bells. The farmhouse lay behind them, its faint orange glow still visible through the trees, as though it were watching them, refusing to let them go. The villagers stumbled forward, dragging the weaker children by hand or carrying them across their shoulders. Their breaths came ragged, hearts pounding as if every beat might draw Elias's wrath closer. For a while there was no plan, only flight, running, crawling, pulling themselves deeper into the tangled dark of the Virginia woods. At last, when the youngest of the children collapsed from exhaustion, they stopped in a small hollow where moss covered the stones and the trees bent low, shielding them like a canopy. The men lowered the children gently, giving them water from their flasks, though it was barely enough for so many. Their bodies trembled, the chill of the night seeping into their thin rags. Thomas knelt among them, his face streaked with soot and blood. His ankle throbbed, each step earlier like fire driving up his leg, but he ignored it. He counted the children, lips moving silently. 39. They had freed 39. That number stabbed into him like a blade. He remembered the boy's words in the cellar. There had been 47. 8, Thomas muttered. 8 are still down there. Samuel, sweat pouring down his face, leaned against a tree. "We can't go back," he said. His voice shook, not with cowardice but with the sheer weight of what they had endured. "You saw him. You heard what he said. That thing is not a man we can fight." Thomas looked at the children, their eyes wide, hollow, staring at him as though he were the last rope keeping them from drowning. He wanted to say Samuel was wrong, that they could march back and free the rest. But the image of Elias, blood dripping down his temple, yet smiling like death itself, silenced him. The forest was too still, no owls hooted, no crickets sang. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then faintly the sound of a child's giggle rippled through the dark, high-pitched, playful. Wrong. Every head snapped up, eyes searching the trees. One of the girls whimpered, clutching her knees. "It's them," she whispered. "They always come after he lets us out." The men froze. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, crouching beside her. Her name was Eliza, no more than 11 years old, her wrists raw from iron. She kept her eyes on the ground as she spoke, the ones who tried before. They didn't get far. He let them think they escaped. But the woods belong to the Covenant, too. They always come. The giggle came again, this time from behind them. Then another laugh from the left, followed by a whisper too faint to understand. The children huddled together, clutching each other, their bodies trembling violently. Samuel gripped his broken chair leg tighter. "It's just tricks," he said, though his voice betrayed the truth. He didn't believe his own words. A branch snapped. Out of the shadows, shapes began to emerge. Not Elias, not the Sullivan women, but figures smaller, hunched, moving with an unnatural lurch. Moonlight revealed faces pale as bone, eyes black and glistening children. Not alive, not dead, their limbs stiff as though bound by invisible strings. One of the rescued children screamed. The forest erupted in chaos. The figures shuffled closer, their mouths opening in eerie unison. A sound spilled out, a droning chant that matched the rhythm from the farmhouse. The Covenant had followed them. Thomas shouted, rallying the men. "Keep them back! Don't let them near the little ones." The villagers swung their makeshift weapons, striking at the pale figures. Wood cracked against bone, but the creatures did not fall like men. They staggered, then righted themselves, their hollow chants never breaking. One clawed hand reached for a child, its nails jagged, and Samuel drove the chair leg through its chest. The thing collapsed, but its mouth still moved, whispering the chant even as it lay motionless. The rescued children wailed, clutching at their protectors. Every cry, every scream seemed to fuel the apparitions. More shapes drifted between the trees, their eyes glinting like shards of glass. The forest, once their refuge, had become another trap. Eliza pulled at Thomas's sleeve, tears streaking her dirt-stained face. "You can't fight them," she begged. "They don't die. He makes them from the ones who failed. If you stop moving, they'll take you too." Thomas's mind reeled. Failed escapees. These figures were the Covenant's trophies, bound forever to hunt the living. Elias's words thundered back into his mind. The curse follows. He forced himself to stand, ignoring the agony in his ankle. "We move," he ordered. "Deeper into the forest. We keep moving no matter what." The men gathered the children once more, pushing them forward into the undergrowth as the apparitions closed in. The night became a blur of running, stumbling, dragging exhausted bodies through roots and mud. Every time they glanced back, the pale shapes were there, relentless, chanting in unison with the voices still echoing faintly from the farmhouse. Hours bled together. The moon shifted across the sky. The younger children collapsed repeatedly, and the villagers lifted them, carrying them until their own bodies screamed for rest. Still, they did not stop. They could not. Finally, at the edge of dawn, they stumbled into a clearing where an abandoned hunter's shack stood crooked against the trees. It was nothing more than rotting boards and a collapsed roof, but it offered walls, a place to gather, a chance to breathe. The children crowded inside, their eyes wild, their bodies huddled together like a single trembling creature. Samuel barred the doorway with a fallen branch, though it felt like a meaningless gesture against what hunted them. The chanting had faded with the coming light, but none of them believed it was over. They could still feel eyes watching from the tree line. The curse had not been broken. It had only stretched its claws further into their lives. Thomas sank against the wall, his body shaking with exhaustion. He met Samuel's eyes, the unspoken truth hanging heavy between them. They had escaped the cellar, yes, but not the Covenant. Elias had been right. They were bound now. The pale light of dawn crept across the clearing, staining the shack in hues of gray. The forest, once alive with whispers and phantom laughter, had gone silent, but the silence itself was suffocating. The villagers huddled inside the crooked structure. The children pressed against one another like a flock of frightened birds. Their wide eyes stared into the cracks between the boards, as though expecting pale faces to appear at any moment. Thomas sat with his back against the wall, his rifle laid useless across his knees. The chamber was empty. The single shot he had fired at Elias the night before had been wasted, and no more bullets remained. His ankle throbbed, swollen and purple now, but he said nothing. Pain was easier than listening to the rising murmur of panic inside the shack. Samuel paced back and forth, his hands trembling as he gripped the broken chair leg like a club. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "They'll come with the night again. You all heard the girl. They'll hunt us until none of us are left. Then we keep moving, Thomas said, though even as he spoke, his voice sounded hollow. They had been running since midnight, stumbling through roots and shadows, dragging nearly 40 children through mud and thorns. They were exhausted, starved, and broken. Another villager, Matthew, slammed his fist against the wall. And where do you expect us to go? We don't even know if we're still on Sullivan land. For all we know, this entire forest belongs to them. We're trapped, and every step we take just brings us closer to their curse. His words hung in the air like smoke. The children whimpered softly, as though his despair were contagious. Eliza, the 11-year-old girl who had warned them the night before, whispered from where she sat clutching 2 younger children. It doesn't matter where you go. Once you've seen him, once you've heard the covenant, it's inside you. You can't leave it behind. The shack seemed to grow colder at her words. Samuel stopped pacing and stared at her. What do you mean, inside us? The girl's eyes were distant, as though she was remembering something she wished she could forget. He told us once, she said. When the covenant is renewed, the chosen carry it in their blood. It whispers to you. It waits. You can't escape it because it becomes you. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her knees. Samuel swore under his breath. So what, we're cursed now? All of us? Even the children? The villagers began to argue, voices rising, fear sharpening into anger. Some said they should split up, take their own families, and run. Others muttered that they should never have taken the children in the first place. That by dragging them out of the cellar, they had only carried the curse with them. One man, Joseph, said the words that had been festering in the dark corners of their minds. Maybe we leave the children. They're the ones the covenant wants. If we abandon them, maybe the curse will pass us by. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The children gasped, clutching at their rescuers, their hollow eyes filled with fresh terror. Thomas struggled to his feet, rage flashing through the exhaustion that had nearly broken him. You'll do no such thing, he growled. We didn't crawl through that hell to abandon them here like animals. If anyone's cursed, it's all of us now. Their blood is our blood. Joseph stepped forward, his face red with desperation. Easy for you to say, Thomas. You've got no wife waiting at home, no children of your own. I've got mouths to feed. What if I carry this thing back to them? What if I bring the curse into my own house? You want me to sacrifice my blood for these half-dead strangers? The shack erupted again, men shouting, some pushing at one another, their fear spilling out like poison. The children sobbed louder, the air thick with panic. And then came the whisper. It was faint at first, drifting through the cracks in the shack like a draft of air. A low, sibilant murmur, too soft to understand but unmistakably human. Every voice in the shack died at once. The men froze. The children buried their faces in each other's shoulders. The whisper grew louder. Not one voice, but many, layered atop one another, speaking in unison. The covenant's chant. It rose and fell like the rustle of leaves, but no wind stirred outside. Joseph backed against the wall, his face white. They found us, he rasped. No, Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. It's not outside. She pointed to her temple. It's in here. The men looked at one another in horror as the whispers pressed deeper, threading into their skulls like hooks. The chant filled their heads, a rhythm that made their hearts pound in unison. Some clutched at their ears, but no amount of pressure silenced the sound. Samuel dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, clutching his head. Get it out, he sobbed. For the love of God, get it out. The children cried harder, and some of them began to repeat the chant without realizing it, their voices joining the invisible chorus. Their small mouths moved in perfect rhythm, eyes glazed, bodies rocking gently. Thomas forced himself to stand, his ankles screaming in protest. He shouted over the noise, trying to rally them. It's lies! It's tricks! Fight it! But even as he yelled, he felt the chant worming into him, a weight pressing down on his chest, slowing his breath. His hands trembled. For a moment he feared he too would begin to echo the covenant. Then, suddenly, a scream cut through the chanting. Joseph had grabbed one of the children, a boy no more than 7, and dragged him toward the door. It wants them, he shouted, his face twisted in terror. We give it one, maybe it lets us go! The shack erupted into chaos again. Samuel lunged at Joseph, prying the boy from his arms, the 2 men grappling violently. The others shouted, some calling for Joseph's blood, others screaming that Samuel was condemning them all. The children wailed, their voices blending with the whispers, the chant growing louder until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. In the chaos, Thomas staggered toward the doorway. He shoved a plank of wood into the crack, slamming it shut, his breath ragged. He turned back to face them all, his voice hoarse but firm. "No one leaves them behind," he roared. "No one! If we're cursed, then we fight it together. If we die keeping them safe. That's the only way we stand against this." For a moment, his words cut through the madness. The men froze, their chests heaving, their eyes bloodshot. The whispers still echoed inside their skulls, but Thomas's voice, raw with conviction, gave them something else to hold on to. The shack was still again, save for the trembling breaths of the children. The dawn light filtered through the broken boards, fragile and thin. The curse had not lifted. It would not. But for now, the villagers held together. And yet deep in the woods, just beyond the clearing, something moved. The covenant had not given up. Its patience was eternal. Night fell quickly in the forest, swallowing what little safety the daylight had offered. By the time the last streaks of red faded from the horizon, the shack was little more than a coffin of rotting boards holding 40 terrified children and a handful of desperate men. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind outside set nerves on edge. They had braced the door with logs and stones, but everyone knew such barriers meant little against what hunted them. The first sound came just after nightfall, a distant hum, low and steady, like the drone of bees hidden deep in the trees. At first the men told themselves it was only the wind, but then the pitch shifted, voices layering one over the other until the hum became a chant. That familiar rhythm, the covenant's rhythm, poured through the forest like a living tide. The children whimpered, curling into each other. Some began to rock, mouthing the chant without realizing it, their small voices echoing the sound outside. Thomas barked at them to stay quiet, but his own throat felt tight, the words like hooks dragging across his mind. Then came the light. Small flames flickered between the trees, weaving slowly closer. Torches, dozens of them, carried by figures emerging from the shadows. At first only their pale faces were visible, but soon the whole procession came into view, children with black, glassy eyes, their bodies stiff and jerking like puppets, followed by the towering shapes of alias Sullivan and his kin. They moved slowly, deliberately, forming a circle around the shack. Their chant grew louder, rising and falling like a heartbeat. The flames of their torches did not flicker with the breeze. They burned steady, unnatural. Inside, Samuel gripped his club so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They've come to finish it," he whispered. Thomas forced himself to his feet, his injured ankle screaming. "Then we hold," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "We hold as long as we can. We don't let them take another child." The chanting stopped all at once, plunging the clearing into an eerie silence. Elias stepped forward, his tall frame lit by the glow of a torch. His face was calm again, composed, though the faint scar where Thomas's bullet had grazed him gleamed red in the firelight. He lifted his hands as if blessing the shack. "You cannot keep them," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the night air. "They are bound to the covenant. You think you saved them, but you have only stolen them for a time. Return them, and your burden will lift. Resist, and the curse will consume you." The villagers shouted back, their fear boiling into rage. "We'll never give them to you!" Samuel roared, slamming his club against the wall for emphasis. Elias's smile did not waver. "So be it." He lowered his hands. The pale children moved first. They shuffled forward, their chains dragging, their mouths opening in perfect unison. A shrill cry burst from them, rising higher and higher until it pierced the men's ears like knives. The walls of the shack trembled with the sound. Boards rattled, nails loosened. Dust rained down from the beams. The villagers rushed to the walls, pressing their weight against the boards, but the cursed children clawed at the wood with impossible strength. Their fingers dug splinters loose, their black eyes fixed on the trembling figures inside. One small hand shot through a crack, grabbing a rescued child by the hair. The girl screamed, and Thomas struck the hand with his rifle butt until it let go, leaving strands of hair behind. More hands followed, clawing, grabbing, tearing at the boards. The men shouted, swinging their weapons at the cracks, their blows connecting with bone and flesh. The pale children did not bleed, but they recoiled only for a moment before pressing forward again. Their chanting merged with their shrieks until the sound became unbearable, filling every corner of the shack, rattling inside every skull. Then came the fire. A torch arced through the air, striking the roof with a burst of sparks. Dry boards crackled instantly, flames crawling along the beams. Smoke filled the shack, the children coughing and crying. "They mean to burn us out!" Samuel shouted. Panic surged. Some men rushed to smother the fire with their coats, while others struck at the walls, desperate to open a way out. The children clung to them, shrieking, their terror fueling the frenzy inside. Through the smoke, Thomas saw Elias standing still, his torch raised high, his eyes gleaming with something darker than triumph. He was not in a hurry. He could wait. The covenant was patient. But Thomas was not. He limped to the wall, grabbed a loose beam, and wrenched it free with a roar. The gap it left revealed the night air, and with it, the sight of pale faces staring back at him. Without hesitation, he shoved the beam forward, striking one across the jaw. Bone cracked. But the thing only smiled, black eyes unblinking. "Through here!" Thomas bellowed. "Out before we're smoke and ash!" The men heaved, tearing more boards loose until a hole gaped wide enough for the smallest children. They shoved them through first, into the grass outside, where terrified sobs joined the crackle of fire and the endless chanting. The pale figures surged, but the villagers fought them back, swinging clubs, beams, anything they could wield. Samuel hauled one child after another through the hole, his arms burning, his throat raw from shouting. Flames licked the rafters now, heat pressing down like a heavy hand. Thomas was the last at the gap, dragging a boy forward, when a pale hand shot through and seized his arm. The grip was iron, cold as ice. Elias's voice rang out above the chaos. "You carry the covenant now, Thomas. You cannot flee it. You cannot fight it. Every breath you take is ours." For a moment, Thomas felt the truth of it deep in his bones. The whispers pressed against his mind, urging him to let go, to surrender. But he looked at the boy in his arms, eyes wide with terror, and something burned hotter than the fire consuming the shack. He swung his rifle butt with all his strength, shattering the grasping wrist. The hand released, and Thomas shoved the boy through the gap before crawling out himself. The survivors spilled into the clearing, choking on smoke, surrounded by chanting and firelight. The circle of torches had tightened, the pale children closing in, the Sullivan family looming behind them like judges at a trial. The shack collapsed in flames, sparks showering the night. The villagers clutched the children close, their weapons slick with blood and ash. They had escaped the cellar. They had escaped the woods. And now, they had escaped the fire. But the covenant still surrounded them, endless, unyielding. Elias raised his hands once more, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Run again if you wish. But every path leads back to me. The covenant is eternal. You belong to it now." And as the flames devoured the shack behind them, the survivors realized Elias was not lying. They were not fighting for freedom anymore. They were only fighting for time. The forest stretched endlessly before them, the smoke of the burning shack curling into the sky behind like a black banner of defeat. The chanting had quieted for now, as though Elias and his brood had allowed them to flee, confident there was no true escape. The silence that followed was not mercy. It was a hunter's pause, letting its prey stagger further before the killing strike. The villagers pressed on through the night, dragging the children deeper into the trees. Their torches had burned out, and only the thin silver of moonlight guided them. Roots snagged their boots, branches clawed their faces, and exhaustion hollowed out their steps. The children were beyond tears now, their faces pale masks, their bodies trembling but voiceless. At last, just before dawn, the trees thinned. The survivors stumbled into a clearing where crooked stones jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Some stood tall, others had toppled and half sunk into moss, but all bore faint carvings eroded by rain and time. The men recognized it instantly, a graveyard, abandoned long before their fathers' fathers had walked these woods. The air here was different, heavy and unmoving. A thick mist curled between the stones, and the silence of the forest deepened into something oppressive. Not even insects dared stir. At the far end of the graveyard, half swallowed by the earth, stood the skeletal remains of a church. Its roof had caved in long ago, leaving only the leaning frame of its walls and the splintered cross that hung at an angle above the collapsed door. The survivors stared at it with both dread and relief. A ruin, yes, but a place with walls, a place to breathe without fire licking their backs. "We'll rest here," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "The children can't take another step." The men led the little ones among the graves, laying them on patches of grass damp with dew. Some of the children curled immediately into sleep, their bodies too broken to resist. Others clung to their rescuers, afraid to close their eyes. Samuel walked slowly among the stones, brushing moss from one with his hand. The letters were almost gone, but he could still make out a name: Jonathan Whitmore, 1792-1831. He frowned. "Whitmore," he muttered. "I've heard that name before." Thomas limped to his side, wincing with each step. "Whitmore." Samuel nodded. "An old family. Preachers, I think. Moved out here when Virginia was still untamed. Folks used to say they were touched by God, but—" He trailed off, his eyes darkening. Others said something darker. Their conversation was cut short by Eliza's voice. The girl stood before the ruined church, her thin arm outstretched toward the splintered door. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide with certainty. "This is where it began," she whispered. The men exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean, child?" Thomas asked gently. Eliza hugged herself tightly. Elias told us stories about the first covenant, how his family made the pact, right here long before I was born. He said this place is sacred to them. That's why they can't be broken, because the covenant is buried in the ground itself. A chill swept through the survivors. The mist thickened, curling around their ankles. The graves seemed to lean closer, as if listening. Despite his fear, Thomas pushed forward, limping to the church door. He shoved it open, the wood groaning as if it resented being disturbed. Inside, the ruin smelled of mildew and rot, but beneath it lingered something sharper, coppery metallic, like dried blood. The floor had collapsed in places, exposing the earth below. Broken pews lay scattered like corpses. At the far end of the room, where the altar should have stood, a pit yawned in the ground. Stones ringed its edges, carved with faint, unfamiliar symbols. The earth inside was blacker than any soil Thomas had ever seen, as though it had been scorched. The survivors gathered at the threshold, their breaths shallow. Samuel crossed himself instinctively, though his hand shook. "God help us," he whispered. "This ain't no church. It never was." Eliza stepped inside, her bare feet silent on the broken boards. She pointed to the pit. "That's where they made the covenant. Elias said his bloodline was bound to it, and everyone they took became part of it too. That's why the children couldn't die. That's why the pale ones follow us." Her words seemed to awaken the room. A faint whisper rose from the pit, low and distant, like a voice carried on the wind. The villagers stiffened, clutching their weapons. The whisper grew clearer, splitting into many voices, chanting the same rhythm they had heard in the cellar, in the forest, at the shack. The covenant lived here. The children whimpered, some covering their ears, others swaying as though the chant tugged at them. One little boy began to walk toward the pit, his eyes glazed, but Thomas seized him, pulling him back with rough strength. "Not another step," he growled. His voice was steady, but inside his heart pounded with terror. Samuel peered into the pit, his face pale in the dim light. "If this is where it began," he said slowly, "then maybe it's where it ends." Thomas turned to him sharply. "You're saying we destroy it?" Samuel nodded. "What else is there? We can't outrun them. We can't fight them. But maybe, just maybe, we can break what they built." The men looked to one another, their fear battling with the small, flickering flame of hope. The children clung tighter to them, sensing the shift. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "If you try," she whispered, "they'll come. They always come when someone touches the pit." As if to prove her words, the wind outside rose sharply, slamming the broken door against the wall. The chant from the pit swelled louder, rattling the rotting beams of the church. From beyond the graveyard came another sound, the distant crack of branches, the shuffle of many feet. The Sullivans were already on their way. The survivors stood frozen, caught between dread and determination. The pit yawned before them, promising either destruction or salvation. Behind them, the covenant closed in. Thomas gripped his useless rifle like a staff, his jaw tight. "If this is the root," he said, "then we tear it out. Tonight we face them here." The whispers from the pit rose to a roar, mingling with the approaching chant of the Sullivans. The old church shuddered, its walls groaning, as though the ground itself prepared for the coming clash. The ruined church groaned as though it remembered every curse ever spoken within its rotting walls. The survivors huddled around the pit, their breaths white in the cold mist that seeped through the cracks. Outside, the sound of shuffling feet and low chanting grew closer, circling the graveyard like wolves around a pen. The children whimpered, clutching at skirts and sleeves, their hollow eyes searching the adults for safety that could not be promised. Samuel's hands trembled as he held the torch he had managed to relight from a smoldering scrap of wood. The flame flickered weakly, its glow a small island in a sea of darkness. "They're here," Eliza whispered. She stood at the doorway, her frame slight and trembling, but her voice steady. "They always come when the pit wakes." Thomas leaned heavily on his rifle, jaw clenched. He could feel the vibration under his boots, the earth humming with the chant as if the pit itself was alive. "Then let them come," he growled. "We end it here." The first pale figure appeared between the gravestones. A boy no older than 12, his body thin as bone, his eyes blank. More followed, slipping through the mist, silent and endless. They gathered at the edge of the ruined church, their faces tilted toward the survivors, waiting. And then Elias came. His tall frame seemed to carry the shadows with him, his face half hidden in the dark, but his voice cut sharp and clear. "You've run far enough." He stepped into the church, his pale children parting for him like a tide. "Bring them back. The covenant calls. You cannot break what was sworn." Thomas stepped forward, planting himself between the children and Elias. His voice was rough but strong. "We're not giving them back. This ends tonight." Old Elias smiled faintly, as though amused. "Ends, foolish man. The covenant never ends. Blood binds blood, and every breath you steal from it must be paid." At his words, the pit roared to life. The ground shook violently, dust and shards of wood falling from the ruined beams above. The black soil within the pit seemed to boil, shapes writhing beneath the surface. A stench of rot and iron filled the air, making the survivors gag. One of the chained children cried out, covering her ears as the chanting grew deafening. The pale children outside began to sway in unison, their mouths opening to echo the chant, though no sound came from their throats. Samuel's torch flared as though caught in a sudden wind. He raised it high, eyes wild. "The pit is the root! We burn it! We bury it! We end them!" Elias's smile widened, but his eyes burned with fury. "Touch it," he hissed, "and you'll feed it with your own souls." Before Thomas could answer, the church doors slammed shut of their own accord, sealing the survivors inside with the Sullivans. The walls rattled, and the pit's black soil began to climb upward, forming hands, faces, half-formed bodies that clawed toward the living. The survivors acted at once. Samuel hurled the torch into the pit. Flames licked across the surface, but instead of catching, the fire seemed swallowed, sucked into the earth with a hiss. The pit screamed, not with sound, but with a vibration that rattled bones and teeth. Elias bellowed a command, and his pale children surged forward. They swarmed through the broken walls and shattered windows, moving not like humans but like shadows pulled by strings. The survivors fought with what little they had: broken planks, rusted tools, bare fists. The air filled with cries, wood splintering, and the hiss of inhuman voices. Thomas swung his rifle like a club, knocking a pale boy aside, only for two more to lunge at him. Eliza seized a child by the arm, pulling him free before the pale ones could drag him toward the pit. Samuel snatched a fallen lantern, smashing it against the stones to scatter flames across the floorboards. The fire spread quickly, racing along the rotted wood, catching the beams above. Smoke filled the church, curling upward like the breath of the covenant itself. Elias moved through the chaos untouched, his hand raised toward the pit as though commanding it directly. "You cannot kill what is eternal," he thundered. "The covenant has fed for a century. It will feed for centuries more." But for the first time, there was strain in his voice, a crack in the certainty. The fire was growing, licking the edges of the pit, forcing the shadows to recoil. Thomas locked eyes with Samuel. Both men understood without words. This was the only chance. "Pull them back?" Thomas roared, yanking the children away from the pit. "Samuel, now." Samuel plunged into the chaos, grabbing a heavy beam from the collapsed roof. With a shout, he rammed it into the pit, breaking the ring of carved stones. The ground howled, a thunderous noise that shook the very air. The pale children shrieked, staggering as if strings had been cut. Elias roared, his face twisted with rage and fear. "No, you'll damn us all!" The survivors pressed harder, tearing at the stones, breaking the circle. Each one shattered with a crack like bone snapping. The pit convulsed, black soil erupting like ash, spraying the church in a storm of darkness. The fire spread faster, feeding on the surge. Elias stumbled toward the pit, his hands outstretched. "It's mine!" "It's ours." But before he could reach it, the earth collapsed inward with a deafening roar, swallowing fire, stones, and shadows alike. The floor caved, dragging Elias down into the abyss. His scream echoed, then was cut off as the pit sealed itself, a final gasp of black smoke rising before silence fell. The church trembled one last time, then began to collapse. The survivors grabbed the children, dragging them through the broken walls into the graveyard. They stumbled into the open air just as the church roof caved, sending sparks and embers into the night sky. The pale children who had swarmed them now lay scattered among the gravestones, lifeless husks, their blank eyes staring at nothing. The chanting was gone. The forest was silent again. The survivors collapsed among the graves, coughing, bleeding, and trembling. The children clung to them, their small bodies shaking with terror and relief. Above them the dawn broke slowly, the first pale light of morning touching the mist. For the first time since the nightmare began, there was no sound of footsteps, no chanting, no whispers. Only silence. Thomas stared at the smoking ruins of the church, his chest heaving. "It's done," he rasped, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "God help us, it has to be done." Eliza sat nearby, staring into the trees. Her face was pale, her eyes haunted. "It's never done," she whispered. "The covenant always finds a way back." The men exchanged a glance, the fragile flame of victory already shadowed by her words. And in the distance, beyond the reach of dawn, the forest sighed, as though something deep within it had only just begun to stir. The fire smoldered for days. The ruins of the old church lay buried beneath blackened timbers and collapsed stone, the ground still warm when the sun rose on the morning after. The graveyard around it stood silent, the crooked stones leaning as though bowed in mourning. The survivors sat among the graves, huddled in weary silence. Their faces were streaked with soot and blood, their clothes torn. The children clung to them like shadows, their hollow eyes unblinking. No one spoke for a long time, afraid that words might break the fragile peace that hung in the morning air. Thomas sat apart from the others, his rifle resting across his knees, though it had long since lost its usefulness. His eyes fixed on the smoking pit that had once been the church. He told himself it was over, that Elias was gone, swallowed by the earth itself. But doubt gnawed at him, louder than hunger, sharper than exhaustion. Eliza's words echoed in his mind, "It's never done." By midday, the group stirred. Samuel forced himself to his feet, though his body shook from fatigue. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice hoarse. "If the covenant's broken, then there's nothing left for us in these woods. We take the children and head east. We find help. We give them a life." The men nodded slowly, their faces pale but determined. They gathered the children, some still too weak to walk, lifting them into their arms. The little ones clung wordlessly, their faces blank with shock. As they prepared to leave, Eliza stood apart, staring at the tree line. Her hair was tangled, her feet bare, but her eyes were sharp, too knowing for her years. Thomas approached her cautiously. "You did well," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You kept them alive." She didn't look at him. Her gaze never left the forest. "He's not gone," she whispered. "The pit swallowed him, yes, but the covenant doesn't die with fire and stone. It waits, it listens, and it always wants more." Thomas laid a rough hand on her shoulder, though he had no words of comfort. Deep inside, he knew she spoke the truth. The journey eastward was long and punishing. The survivors carried the children through the dense forest, across streams and hills, their bodies pushed beyond exhaustion. Some of the little ones fell ill from hunger, their thin frames barely able to endure. But still they pressed on, driven by the desperate need to escape the shadow of the covenant. At last, after what felt like weeks, they stumbled into a small settlement along the edge of the Blue Ridge. The townsfolk stared in horror as the rag group emerged from the trees, half-starved men carrying skeletal children, their clothes scorched, their eyes hollow. The story spilled out in fragments, in sobs, in hoarse confessions. The townsfolk listened, their faces blanching with fear and disbelief. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers. A few turned away, unwilling to accept that such horror could have lived so close, hidden in the Virginia woods. The children were taken in, fed, clothed, bathed. The men were given places to rest, their wounds tended by wary hands. For a time, it seemed the nightmare was truly behind them. But shadows lingered. At night, some of the children screamed in their sleep, their voices carrying the rhythm of chants no one wished to hear again. Others wandered the settlement at odd hours, staring into corners, their lips moving silently as though answering unseen whispers. Eliza grew quiet, withdrawn. She spent long hours sitting alone at the edge of the woods, staring back toward the west. When asked what she saw, she only shook her head. Thomas tried to bury himself in work, chopping wood, repairing fences, anything to keep his hands busy. But at night, when he closed his eyes, he saw Elias's face burning in the firelight, his mouth twisted in fury, his voice echoing, "The covenant never ends." Samuel turned to scripture, reading by candlelight, whispering prayers with trembling hands. Yet even he admitted, one night, that the words gave little comfort. "What we saw," he confessed, "was older than any book I've read, older than us all." Months passed, and still the unease remained. A few of the children grew stronger, their cheeks filling with color. Others, however, remained pale, their eyes distant. One boy disappeared entirely, vanishing from his bed without a trace. His blankets were cold, his footsteps leading to the edge of the forest, and stopping. The townsfolk whispered of curses and hauntings. Some wanted the survivors gone, fearing they had brought darkness with them. Others pitied them, offering food and shelter but never trust. And then came the night when the chanting returned. It was faint at first, a hum in the distance, carried on the wind. But as the moon rose, it grew louder, circling the settlement like a pack of wolves. The children stirred restlessly in their beds, their lips moving to words only they could hear. Eliza stood in the street, her face turned toward the trees, her expression unreadable. "They're calling," she whispered. "They know we're here." Panic spread through the settlement. Men armed themselves, women clutched their children, prayers rose in trembling voices. But the chanting never broke into attack. It lingered, faded, and slipped back into silence with the dawn. Thomas stood watch until the first light of morning, his rifle clutched in white knuckles. His heart was heavy with the truth he could no longer deny. They had not destroyed the covenant. They had only broken one piece of it. The fire, the pit, Elias, all of it had been but one branch of something older, deeper, rooted in the earth itself. Something that would wait centuries if it had to. When the sun rose, the survivors carried on. They built lives where they could, raised the children who remained, and spoke as little as possible of what they had seen. But the fear never left their eyes. And when the wind howled through the trees, when the night fell too silent, they felt it still. The covenant, whispering, watching, waiting. Generations later, the story of the Sullivan family became folklore. Some called it myth, others a cautionary tale. The ruins of the church sank into the earth, covered by moss and time. Travelers passing through spoke of strange cries in the forest, of pale figures glimpsed between the trees. And somewhere, deep in Virginia's soil, the covenant breathed.